Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can check out the podcast at Apple, Google, Spotify, Good Pods, wherever you listen to podcasts pretty much. But the YouTube channel is a good place to go. You can also get exclusive quick take reviews, as well as everything else you'd find on the podcast feed. You can also check out patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. And there you'll find exclusive content, including a new series that I've been doing the past couple months called Leaving the Collection, where I go over a movie that I've had in my collection for a while and watch it and give it one last review before kind of explain why its time in my collection is gone. That is going to be at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. And befitting the topic at hand tonight, I wanted to go ahead and say that my original score for the movie Player PhD, which I worked on earlier this year, is available for pre-order over at Bandcamp. And you can find the link to that on Sonic Cinema, or just go to Bandcamp and look up my name, Brian Skutle, and you can pre-order it, and you will get exclusive access to 2 of the tracks there. And I hope you check that out. It was a quite process, and it was one that I really enjoyed. So This is going to be kind of an interesting episode. It's not the first time we've kind of done a crossover in one time. The first time I had Stuart Deloney kind of tied into our discussion on his Snarky Faith podcast. But this is one that directly responds to a discussion I had on another podcast, and that is I am here with Robert Yaniz Jr., who is the proprietor of Crooked Table and the host of Close Watch and Franchise Detours. About a week or so before this episode is released, we discussed you could hear our discussion of the Wachowskis and Tom Tykwer's Cloud Atlas. Today, we are going to be discussing the score, which I think, in addition to the movie, I think has a big part to play and has always been one of my favorites. But Robert, thank you very much for joining me.
Absolutely, Brian. Thanks for having me back.
So before we get started with this larger discussion, where can people find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find Crooked Table Productions and, as you mentioned, our shows Close Watch and Franchise Detours, where right now I think we're about to do the Dark Knight trilogy. In that show, we believe no movie series travels in a straight line. So every episode we talk about an installment in an ongoing franchise. We just finished the Muppet movies. Speaking of lots and lots of music in there as well as in the Dark Knight trilogy, of course. And on Close Watch, as you just said, our most recent episode was us talking about Cloud Atlas, and you can find that both of the shows and everything we do on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, and other podcatchers, as well as crookedtable.com.
Yeah, and if you are, hopefully you're familiar with Franchise Detours from our epic 3-hour discussion of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3 back in May. It was a lot of fun to talk about that, not only because of the fact that I love that movie so much, but because to listen to the other people Robert had on to discuss those movies, it really does show just how much variety of thought goes into the way different people react to different chapters of a franchise. And I think it's going to be interesting to hear him. I still need to get caught up with his Muppet episodes, and I'm looking forward to hearing the Dark Knight ones as well.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride going down that particular version of Gotham City. We're just breaking it down to the Dark Knight trilogy because doing every Batman movie would just be a whole podcast unto itself. I reserve the right to circle back to the 90s Burton and Schumacher ones at some point. So I'm sure we'll get to that. But in the meantime, I think the Dark Knight trilogy is, considering how much it's held in high esteem and how much it's impacted cinema and the genre specifically since then, I think is really, really fascinating. A franchise that ended the same year that Cloud Atlas came out too, in 2012. So franchise celebrating its 10-year anniversary since its conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go ahead and get started. Before we dive into Cloud Atlas specifically, though, I wanted to ask you, because this is something we've talked about in context of the movies that we've discussed, but we haven't really talked about it in any particular depth. What is your relationship beyond obviously hearing them in the movies? What is your relationship with film soundtracks?
So rich. I have a tendency to, every time I see a film, or most times I see a film, I'm usually either in the car on the way back from the theater, or the next day while I'm writing, looking up on Spotify to see if the soundtrack is there, to see if the score is there. I've lately been listening to the Pearl score quite a bit, because that movie, it does something very specific and very interesting with its sort of grand old Hollywood, Technicolor kind of vibe going on with this sinister underpinning. So I really love that, and it's just something that I've been interested in since forever. I think it started probably as a kid with a lot of the Disney soundtracks, Lion King, Aladdin, and all the Disney Renaissance. Nightmare Before Christmas was a big one for me as well. We're recording this on October, so that's one that I'm listening to a lot lately. And I feel like a lot of cinephiles, my relationship with composers and getting to follow their work over longer periods of time, it's kind of cliche, but it starts with John Williams, it starts to Danny Elfman, it starts with those filmmakers doing music for like the big franchises, the Star Wars and the Batmans and things like that. So as a child, those two were probably my entry point. But then now since then, it's really kind of spiraled out into a larger appreciation for film scores, because it's try and watch any of these movies without music. It's such an important ingredient to it. Most recently, not most recently, but in recent years, I think one of the best examples of that is Alan Silvestri's score for Avengers Endgame. That movie, the portal sequence is entirely based on that song and the impact that music has when that scene happens. Yes, you're seeing all the actors, but the music punctuates when Tom Holland's Spider-Man swings through the portal, or when the late Chadwick Boseman comes through as T'Challa. Like and Silvestri's another one of those composers since Back to the Future and Roger Rabbit that's really kind of been on my radar, and it's a very, and especially as a writer, as someone who's always listening to something on the background, that's usually a film score. So it's they're very intertwined, my appreciation for the music and the film itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've already talked quite a bit about my history of film scores, because our first discussion on Close Watch was For the Crow, which is my favorite film soundtrack of all time, and just how foundational that score and that soundtrack is for me. We're kind of talking about another one today, and it's Cloud Atlas is an interesting one. It is composed by, it's one of the few. It's a score that is composed by one of the directors. Tom Tykwer is one of the composers on here, as well as Johnny Klimek and Reinhold Heil. And this was a score. We talked a little bit about my first reaction to Cloud Atlas on Close Watch, so I won't necessarily rehash that here. But the thing that I took away so much from this movie was, like you, I had to get the soundtrack immediately after listening to it and after watching the movie. And this is you can ask my coworkers at the time. This is a soundtrack that I had on loop for months. It's such a hypnotic score. And the thing, it's in my reading my review, I think the last time I had a score that impacted me this much from a film before Cloud Atlas was The Fountain, which is another movie about interlocking stories at different points in history. But that score by Clint Mansell for that movie, it's such an interesting sound. The way that he uses Kronos Quartet, the way he uses Mogwai in his orchestrations there is just so amazing. This is a score that's very much in the classical tradition, very much in the classical configuration of what an orchestra sounds like, very much in the vein of what John Williams scores sound like, what old Hollywood scores sound like. What were your impressions of the score when you first saw Cloud Atlas?
It felt like something. It felt like a sort of classical theme, and this is, of course, the whole point of its role in the film. It felt like a piece of classical music that had existed forever. Like it felt like something that you would stumble across randomly and be like, "What is this?" Like, and which is why its inclusion in that sequence, when Louisa Ray, Halle Berry's character in the 1973 segment, goes into the store and hears it playing. And the store clerk is like, yeah, I don't know. I just can't stop playing it. I know we're not supposed to, but, it's, as you were talking about it, like the opening chords were running through my head. And I think it's so ingrained in this story in a way that most movies don't have the score involved, because not only is it playing in the background and punctuating the scenes and kind of drawing the story forward, it's literally a part of the story itself. This film has it's diegetic at points with the Ben Whishaw, the Robert Frobisher character. Mm-hmm. And it's not only that, it's part of this ongoing chain that as creative people, Brian, it particularly resonates with us, because this is a movie where Robert Frobisher is inspired by this memoir that he's reading of Adam Ewing that is unfinished, that he doesn't have the other half of the book, so he doesn't know that Adam Ewing's story ends happily. Had he known that, perhaps his story might have ended differently, but he doesn't get to discover that. And then that score comes to play later on and leads to a film, and the way that the art ripples throughout time, leading to that revolution in neo soul, and then ultimately sort of the story with Zachary and Marinim. I think it's a beautiful testament to art as the legacy that these individuals leave behind. Mm-hmm. And that it trickles down from a book to a symphony, to a film that inspires a revolution that becomes legend, that becomes Sanmi is treated as a god by the time you get to the 2321 story after the fall. And ultimately that whole ripple effect starts with Adam Ewing and Robert Frobisher. And I think it's, mm-hmm. It's one of those things that in a lot of times when you're dealing with tragedy, or you're dealing with, most recently on a grand scale, a pandemic, and the obvious question is, well, why would I bother doing that? Does this matter? Like, what is the point of pursuing art when there's these real life tragedies out there? Like, is this really the best use of my time? You saw a lot of that after 9/11. A lot of people being like, well, how do we continue now with comedy, or music or filmmaking or escapism, when clearly there are things that need to be addressed? And I think this film is a testament to that stuff matters. Yeah, it makes an impact. It changes people's lives. It can change the course of history if it gets into the right hands. And the score to this movie is emblematic of that, because it's literally affecting the characters in the movie. It is in itself sort of a character of the movie, and the fact that, you know, the Cloud Atlas sextet is a term that could be applied to not only Frobisher's score, but also the 6 characters, the 6 stories in this. The music is essentially the title character of this movie.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, and I touched on that a little bit when we were talking about the movie itself on Close Watch, and it's worth repeating here. And you brought up the word diegetic music. So if you are not familiar with the term diegetic music, if you're listening to this, diegetic music is basically source music. It's music that comes from, as a part of the fictional setting of a narrative, whether it's a film, whether it's a video game. And so it's basically something that interacts directly with the characters of the story. The Cantina band sequence in Star Wars is a great example of diegetic music. It's music that takes place within the world of Star Wars. Probably my favorite example outside of Cloud Atlas is Touch of Evil, the Orson Welles film. The way that Henry Mancini's music, and I mean, really, Mancini is a great example of using score very diegetically, in the way that he repeats themes in ways that are very real world to the narratives, whether you're talking about Touch of Evil, whether talking about the Pink Panther or Charade or Shot in the Dark and all of that stuff. He was a master at that. So yeah, the Cloud Atlas, it's interesting because yes, the Cloud Atlas sextet, as I mentioned, a sextet is essentially a musical piece with 6 parts. And as you reinforced here, we're dealing with 6 stories. We're dealing with 6 main characters, 6 main actors. And this is very much, the sextet is the title, essentially the title piece of the music. And the thing that I find is interesting is that when they are writing the score, when they're writing the underscore, they're very careful, it feels like, in how they use the sextet theme. The sextet almost entirely exists as source music and not as part of the score. Now, if you listen to the score individually, you can tell that there are moments where that theme kicks in, but for the most part, they have a completely separate theme for the score, which is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And they, not only that, the music in the film is reused in different ways in different time periods. It pops up in different. It reminds me, and this is a comparison I made on my show as well. It reminds me of in Everything Everywhere All at Once. Not to go back to that again, but the Absolutely Story of a Girl, which is was quoted by one of the characters at one point, and then the filmmakers, the Daniels, reached out to the musician whose name escapes me, who was the lead singer and songwriter of 9 Days, the band that did that song, and had him write alternate versions. So there's like a slow, like country ballad version of it playing on the car radio during one scene. There's like a grungier version playing during the kind of the dominatrix sequence of that film. Like, it pops up about 3 or 4 or 5 different times in that movie in different ways to sort of signify the distinction between those different stories, those different worlds, and their connectivity. And I think you see that kind of at play in Cloud Atlas as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I mean, what you said about basically this is a film that, and I think it's part of the reason why it connected with me so much, even if I wouldn't necessarily have written it this way, even if I wouldn't have necessarily expressed it this way, it's something that I definitely recognize now as I watch it again and again, is this idea that art is something that works on people throughout the generations. I mean, you mentioned the memoir from Ewing, basically inspiring the Cloud Atlas Sextet. Then you have that lovely little scene where Louisa Ray is getting the copy of the sextet, and the store owner, or the store clerk, who's also played by Ben Whishaw, who plays Frobisher, is listening to it, and he just can't stop listening to it. It's intoxicating. And then the 2012 scene you have in a different context as almost like Muzak in a way. And then of course you have that great in Neo Soul serves several purposes, because you hear one of the characters playing it on an instrument that's just sort of like a different type of string instrument that. And I don't know if you've ever noticed that in the film, where it's like, and it's played by, it's a character played by Jim Broadbent, who played the composer that Frobisher was working with when he wrote the sextet. And now Broadbent's character is playing it while they go through the slums of Neo Soul to the Revolution's sort of main hideout and stuff like that. But it's also score in the really over melodramatic like movie of Cavendish's life, in that Tom Hanks plays Cavendish in.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's this choral. There's this choral aspect to it that is that the replicants sing it as they're going to exaltation, and which you mentioned on Close Watch, and the ways that it uses that theme while also giving us other ideas and other little motifs that I think is really it's one of the most interesting soundtracks to listen to collectively speaking. Because, I mean, you can listen to the sextet on the soundtrack, and it's great because of the fact that it works with the film. And the thing that I think is kind of interesting is that the score really is predominantly strings. It really isn't a full orchestra. It's predominantly a string orchestra, which is really kind of an interesting choice, other than the percussion that's used.
Yeah. No, it is. It's very epic in scope, but also minimalist in execution, which I think is an interesting contradiction that I think also kind of feels like emblematic of the film. The fact that we are following these 6 stories across hundreds of years, but also these are just the stories of 6 people and their sort of inner struggles to do the right thing, to move the needle forward just a little bit with the small amount of time they have on this planet. And I think it has, like you were saying, it has such a unique relationship to the film. It's unlike any film and music sort of dynamic that I've ever seen.
Yeah. And the fact that there's this entire, like, they could have easily just leaned on the sextet theme throughout the score, and it would have been basically this main theme that they that just permeates throughout the rest of the film. But I love that, and it's really the main theme of the score. Da, da, wait a minute. I can't sing it to save my. But if you listen to the track New Directions, which I think is one of the key moments of not only the narrative, but the music as well. It's the moment where all of these stories seem to be building and reaching their second act climax before getting to the third act. And it's just such a simple theme going up and down, and it's a very romantic theme. It can play as a romantic theme, in like when we see Chang and So Many 451 make love, when we see Frobisher and Sixsmith in that scene breaking plates, and it just all of these moments where it just has, you've got two separate themes that have such an impact on the movie's emotional pull. It's just really, it's really remarkable that that a score can do that in a way that this one does. But I think it's also important because of how big of a narrative we're talking about.
Yeah, I gather by that track title that is that the music that's playing when Tom Hanks' character Isaac Sachs has that voiceover.
Yes.
About
yeah.
He says our lives and our choices like quantum trajectories are understood moment to moment. At each point of intersection, each encounter suggests a new potential direction. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I love that. That was the other on my show. We talked briefly about lines that stick out, and I mentioned something by San Mi. That was the other one that I almost mentioned, was what Isaac Sachs says, because it's exactly that what you're saying. It captures what movies like Crash from 2005. They're trying to capture how people's lives intersect and affect them and push them in different directions and change the course of their lives and all that stuff. And I think Cloud Atlas, for one, does that infinitely more successfully.
Yeah.
And also it's that it happens, that scene is punctuated by the plane that Isaac Sachs is on exploding in the sky. It is sort of feels like it's trying to convey sort of the enduring human spirit that like we all come across each other's paths, and we keep trying to push forward, and then adversity hits, and then the way the movie ends, I think it adds that little bit of hope that, hey, we're going to keep perpetuating, we're going to keep pushing on, and ultimately when Marinam at the end of the film's telling Zachary, is there a deity? I don't know, but we have each other. Essentially, it feels almost to me like the Cloud Atlas sextet as the linking device throughout these different stories is almost like just the universe or God or whatever you want to call it itself, sort of observing from a distance. Marvel sort of permeates my perspective on everything because it's taken over pop culture. So it's almost like the Watcher just kind of looking over all these storylines taking place over time and pushing them forward and giving them room for growth in the long term.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and sort of going with what you were, you mentioned that the voiceover by Sachs at that moment, it's a great moment, and I completely agree. It goes back to something that we talked about on Close Watch to a certain extent, where the film's representations of good and evil, and basically the whole spectrum of human morality in a way, is really very fascinating. And I think Hanks's character really kind of exemplifies that more because of the fact that his doctor in the sequence with Ewing is very much evil. And then the sort of the middle section, the middle part of his trajectory, like he doesn't have a big moment in Frobisher. He's basically a clerk who kind of can tell that Frobisher needs some looking after. He's going to profit off of it. So he's not quite as he's not quite as evil as the doctor is, but at the same time he's not afraid to do some morally ambiguous things there. Yeah. Sachs, you can tell he's kind of trying to do the right thing, but he's unable to go through completely because he dies, so he pays the price for it. And then the author is just kind of very much a step back, but and then you have Zachary at the end, where he's somebody who he has the devil, essentially, old Georgie, working on him constantly, basically telling them, like, the weaker meat and the strong shall eat. And basically this theme of natural selection, this bastardization of the idea of what natural selection is. And, and it's basically Zachary who redeems humanity in a way because of the fact that by pushing through those emotions that Georgie's pushing him towards, he finds the redemption that that was denied Sax earlier on in the film.
Exactly, yeah. And underlying or kind of highlighting exactly that progression that you're saying, the what is, I forget the thing, you already said it and I already forgot. About the meat will the weak are meat and the
strong shall eat. Yeah.
Yes. Is exactly what Dr. Goose says to Adam Ewing when he's trying to sort of finish him off with the poison. So it is exactly what you're saying, like that progression. The film is both subtle in these developments, but also not so subtle at the same time, which is why when we talked about on my show, I was pointing out how it's challenging to the viewers, but also accessible at the same. Like it's complex, but not incomprehensible. Like some critics apparently thought it was in 2012.
And you brought up the fact that inspire, the idea of connectivity and inspiring creativity that connects people through difficult times. You kind of brought that up, and you brought up the pandemic, and it's like I forgot to bring it up on Close Watch, but I did want to bring up Robert Daniels. I know when the pandemic did start, he did a tremendous piece on Cloud Atlas and the idea of connectivity. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about the score for this is the fact that it really ties in that connectivity, and it starts in the opening when, we talked about how it introduces all of the different narrative threads that we're going to go through. And the score is a huge part of what makes that so captivating, because it's starting very early on with this epics, giving us this idea that this is going to be an epic film, and this idea that it's going to be a film where all of these characters, all of these stories are going to be connected somehow, even if we don't exactly know why to start out with. It's really kind of interesting. And I love the different tones that this film plays with. We talked about there's a little bit of dark comedy that are in the Cavendish story. There's some more serious, there's really kind of horror elements to the After the Fall, really, because you're dealing with cannibals and a very ominous devil-like character playing on Zachary, and then you have the neo soul, which is futuristic sci-fi. You have the period romance, the tragic romance. You have the mystery, and then you have the epic, the seafaring epic that and the score works effortlessly in all of these contexts.
It's also the use of language too. If we're talking about, like, it builds off of music is the universal language, but also the language involved in these different stories and how the manner in which these characters speak to each other changes so drastically from the 1849 story specifically to the After the Fall story, where it helps a lot to have this on Blu-ray with subtitles because in theaters, like, you get the gist of it, but their manner of speaking is so far removed from our own that it is jarring to sort of witness, like, how that has evolved. And I think it fits. Each of these stories has their own way of communicating, their own sort of their own language in and of itself. And I think it's it's interesting to sort of note that along with sort of the way the music changes and highlights these different genres, because it's the 2012 story. Like, I legit remember when Mr. Meeks, when they pick him up and he's like, I know, like there was some cheering in my theater. It's really crowd pleasing for a movie that's this thematically rich. The Wachowskis and Tom Tykwer know how to make this not feel like a philosophy course. You know, they know how to infuse life in every facet of the story, whether it's comedy or tragedy or horror, as you were saying. Even with Zachary making the morally questionable, at least according to the abbess, choice of slitting the Kona chief's throat. I thought that was an interesting note too, where the movie ends on a hopeful way, with Zachary ending up with Marinam, with Cavendish ending up with Ursula, with most of these stories, aside from Frobisher's, having a happy ending. I think with Zachary's choice, it puts that little seed of doubt that, hey, this evolution is not over. Yeah. We still have some growing to do. And I think it's those complications, the refusal to give audiences a clear answer, a clear right or wrong, a clear, black or white. This movie lives in the moral gray. And I think that's fascinating, because that's the most realistic portrayal of mankind. Is balancing that scale. And that we mentioned the 6 characters, some of which are inherently good, some of which are inherently evil, some of which change for better or worse. And I think that's it has so much to say with all those details.
Yeah, there's an idea of redemption through the course of helping others, and you really kind of get that feeling throughout all of them. I mean, even with the Frobisher story, where it's like you get the feeling that in his letters to Sixsmith, he's trying to assuage any feeling of hopelessness about their love, where and that moment where he sees him on the church, at the top of the church, and Sixsmith doesn't see him, but he sees Sixsmith, and it's that's just such a beautiful moment. You get the main theme that plays, and it's something that really all of the characters are ultimately redeemed by what they do to help others. I mean, Cavendish is really selfish when it starts out, because of the fact that, yes, he needs money to pay off these gangsters, but at the same time, he's going about very selfishly. And then it's when he helps others escape this situation that he finds himself in, he is able to get his happy ending. And that's kind of the same way with every one of the characters in this movie.
Yeah. None of us are in this alone. Sunmi has her big refrain is we're all, essentially we're all connected. Our lives affect each other. Every act of kindness or every, I forget, I don't have it in front of me at the moment. I did last time we recorded, but I don't have it now. But essentially that's the sentiment, is that, you can affect the course of the future with every act. It all matters. And that's a sentiment that's also really explicitly highlighted by Adam Ewing when he says, oh, this is but what's his name? Reverend Horrocks is like, oh, this is just but a drop in an ocean. And then Adam responds with, well, what is an ocean but a multitude of drops?
Yeah.
And I love that. There's like such powerful, succinct lines, and the Wachowskis at their best. We went through our favorite works of theirs on my show. At their best, they are able to infuse those themes, those messages, and even sometimes life lessons into their stories organically. I think elements of their films, particularly I'm thinking of the middle two Matrix sequels, particularly Reloaded, there are segments in there that are just lectures copy and pasted into a screenplay, and I feel like it's not focused on the narrative. The narrative stops so that they can elucidate what they're trying to get across with this movie. Yeah. And I think in Cloud Atlas, they're so intertwined that it feels seamless, and it has that viewer satisfaction where you don't feel like you're being, it's not didactic. You don't feel like you're being lectured or schooled while you're in the middle of this 3-hour movie. It feels like closure for that character when that line comes out.
Mm-hmm. It really does feel like it feels like a great piece of music, and I would love to watch this just with the isolated score to see how it would play that way, because of the fact that I feel like all of the emotions that are at work in this film would still come through even if you're just listening to the music. Because one of the things that's great about this, where it really does play like a piece of music, where it rises, it falls, has moments of stasis, has moments where it's reshaping itself into something completely different. And it is like the symphony, the movements of a symphony in that way. And it's really fascinating in the way that it takes musical structure into a very narrative structure from a storytelling standpoint, but you don't necessarily feel like this is you don't the music is such a fundamental part of the narrative in this. And it's one of the things that I think is it captures what great film music is, which is a complement to the images, to the story, and it's a fundamental part of the story that even if I think the great soundtracks just, I know you're not supposed to, the film music's not supposed to obviously overshadow the film, but the great soundtracks complement the film. And, we've talked about The Crow. I think that is an excellent example of it as well. Not just because of the way the orchestral score and the soundtrack, the songs play, but the way that everything plays towards the emotions of that final moment that the film builds towards. And it's certainly the case, I think, with Cloud Atlas as well.
Yeah, because of that, it feels... Because I 100% agree with you. There are times, like I said, but when I see a film, I often track down the score. There are some that, it's fun to revisit, but they don't really work as well as independent works of art. They're so tied to, they're so dependent on those images, sort of playing off of the music itself. And the Cloud Atlas score feels like something that was like, if you had told me, and this is sort of what I was thinking with this, specifically with the sextet, that it feels like a piece of classical music that just existed. If you had told me that pieces of this music existed before the movie, or that the Cloud Atlas sextet was something by, Beethoven or Tchaikovsky that they discovered and then based a movie off of, it feels 100%, plausible. Yeah. It feels like a movie based on a piece of classical music instead of a movie that spawns a piece of classical music, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where I think a great film that I actually started to think about was Amadeus, which obviously is built off of Mozart's music, but the way that it uses Mozart's music to score, to give us the emotional charge of the drama that's happening on screen is just fascinating. And it's a great use of it. It's a great example of source music, diegetic music, but also something that previously existed that also just connects us with the characters and with the story in a way that transcends the initial intent of the music as well.
Yeah, definitely.
What are some of your favorite soundtracks?
That's a loaded question. Like I said, I have a lot of them. I tend to gravitate for whatever reason to the because I think this is what my initial sort of entry point was for film scores, to the big themes. So a lot of the Star Wars, the Batmans, the Lord of the Rings, things like that.
Yeah.
But then there's certain other ones that they're much more intimate, that in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years actually, that I've really come to appreciate. The one example being, and I've sort of cooled on the movie a bit, but the score does something very specific to the narrative, and that's the Atonement score by, I think it's Dario Marianelli.
Yeah.
That one, I love that score. I adore it. It's so, because it has the sort of the keys clacking as part of the score, which feeds into the whole unreliable narration of that film and where it ultimately leads. There's the Pan's Labyrinth score by Javier Navarrete that I've listened to a lot. Pretty much also anything involving a lot of piano. There was a period where I was listening to a lot of the Finding Neverland soundtrack, as well as some of the classic ones, Vangelis for Blade Runner, or Ennio Morricone for Psycho. I have a growing collection of film scores. Lately, I haven't gotten as many in physical media, just because we're all digital now these days.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of ones that I've listened to more recently on Spotify. Even just this year, I've been listening to the Everything Everywhere All at Once one, obviously by Son Lux. I've been listening to the Michael Giacchino score for the Batman quite a bit as well. Pretty much, Giacchino has become one of those standbys, like a John Williams, like a Danny Elfman, like a Hans Zimmer, where you're like, oh, even if the movie's like fine, the score will probably be pretty good.
Yeah, exactly.
And it helps that he has a new one like every month. I feel.
I know,
Guy's
right?
Working constantly.
Well, it was wild in 2009 when he. I mean, obviously it's because of production. It's a case of it has nothing to do with, oh my God, he was doing those two at once. It's just a matter of one took longer than the other. In May of 2009, he had Star Trek and he had Up. I mean, it's like when moments like that happen, it's just so wild. I will correct you though. Morricone did not write Psycho. That was Bernard Herrmann.
Oh, Bernard Herrmann. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, Morricone is somebody I absolutely adore, and I've talked about the good, the bad, the ugly here before, and I agree with you on the Atonement score, especially the scene, the LG for Dunkirk sequence in that where that tracking shot that goes with the choir and the choir performing and stuff like that. It's just absolutely amazing piece of film. It's an amazing piece of use of music in a film. I absolutely love that score.
And to our earlier point, that's a sequence where the music the film is drawing attention to the music. It's it's the point of the scene, and I think it sort of emphasizes what we were saying earlier about the score should disappear into the movie, kind of, but also there's a way to accent it without overshadowing the movie itself. It doesn't, as long as it fits the theme and the atmosphere of the movie. If it's not jarring, I think there's a real marriage there. There's a real possibility there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's there's a lot of great things you can talk about music. I mean, I think the Wachowskis, when you listen to, even when you're listening to something like The Matrix, where I mean, Don Davis's score is such a big part of that, but you also have the songs that come into play. But one of the things I love, we were talking about Giacchino a little bit, his score for Speed Racer, where he uses the classic Speed Racer theme, but he also builds on it to create a larger soundtrack for that film. And it's just really quite beautiful. And I love the ways in which the Wachowskis seem to really give composers room to have their own ideas when it comes to what a film score here is. Now, I think this one, you do kind of have to have a very particular one. And, Tykwer's the one who wrote the sextet. And I think it's having that classical base is such an important part of it. If you were to goose if you were to play with each time period in its own way of like having a certain sound for the Ewing sequences versus the Neo Soul sequences versus After the Fall, you will have lost something because of the fact that I think that continuity of what the score in this film represents is such an important thing.
And in researching the film for these episodes, the filmmakers approached this, even though it's 6 main characters across time, as one mega narrative. It's one story that builds. It just happens to be jumping from different character to different character. And I think that's to your point. If the music, if there were 6 different little mini scores, sort of what Robert Rodriguez and Frank Miller did for Sin City, where they had different composers doing, I think John Debney did one, Rodriguez did one, I forget who did them.
Graham Revell did the third one.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Revell did the third
Great
one.
scores, by the way. That film, I love that score in that film as well. But if they had done that, it would have felt like vignette instead of a cohesive one piece. Of one piece of cinema, sort of equivocating to the one piece of music that it sort of works as well. Yeah,
exactly. No, and I mean that is one of those. It's one of those choices when it comes to what is the movie going to sound like musically. And I mean, I know going to talking about the working on the film score that I did earlier this year was really interesting because of the fact that, I'll talk about it at some point in more depth, but it's one of those things where I had specific ideas of what I had in mind in one way, some of which held over into the final score, but some of which don't. And as soon as you see how the film and the score work together, it makes sense that the ideas that didn't work fall by the wayside and what did work works because of the fact that, it goes with what the ideas of the movie are. And I think that's one of that sense of discovery is, I think, important on the creative level. And it really speaks to the collaboration at work that filmmakers need to have with their composers, because of the fact that if you're not necessarily on the same page, it's going to be tougher to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Since we're talking Wachowskis and their scores, what were you? I'm curious. This is sort of a little bit of a mini tangent from Cloud Atlas, but since Klimek and Tykwer did the score for The Matrix Resurrections, what was sort of your take on that score as opposed to having Don Davis come back? Because for obvious reasons, because of the same composers, the Resurrection score feels much more akin to Cloud Atlas than it does the previous Matrix films. But I feel like that film also has more thematically in common with Cloud Atlas in a way.
I would definitely agree with that. I think it is disappointing that Don Davis didn't come back. I feel like the way that score for the Matrix trilogy, especially as they were bringing in more and more electronics, it became a very different thing. And like you said, because of how much Resurrections kind of leans on ideas that they explore in Cloud Atlas. David Mitchell, who wrote the novel Cloud Atlas, was one of the writers on Matrix Resurrection, and obviously the composers are the same as well. I think it makes sense because of the fact that, it's always kind of, how do you feel about that with them changing composers midstream? I mean, you brought up the Avengers earlier. It's like you have most of the Avengers movies were scored by Alan Silvestri, except for Age of Ultron, which was Brian Tyler and Danny Elfman, which is interesting because I never really got a reason as to why Silvestri did not come back for that. But I mean, I know Brian Tyler he worked on like 2 or 3 of the Phase 2 films because he did Iron Man 3, he did Thor: The Dark World, and I think he wrote that Marvel theme. And it's interesting, but you can definitely tell that it's somebody else's ideas, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. Yeah. But it's one of those things where it's like I feel like for this one it kind of makes sense again because of those collaborators that the Wachowskis brought in, or Lily Wachowski brought in on Resurrections. And I think it does make sense that it's a different set of composers, but I think there's also enough that if I remember correctly, I'm not as familiar with the Resurrections scores as I am the other ones. I feel like there's enough. They still lean on some of the same themes, but obviously the sound is a bit different.
Right.
And I think so long as you're not necessarily abandoning those themes and it ties into what you're wanting to do with the film, I think it's fine.
Yeah. I think it's also, I wonder how indicative it is of the fact that it was actually Lana that did Resurrections, not Lily, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But the fact that Lana was involved and Lily wasn't, it makes me wonder like which Wachowski sisters is interested in certain particular aspects of the storytelling. Like, was Lily more the driving force of the spectacle, the action, and whereas Lana's much more focused on the cerebral side of things? Because that's one of the big things that a lot of people criticize Resurrections for, is the action sequences are not up to par with previous Matrix films, which I don't disagree with, but it's also, there's enough for me to engage with intellectually and as a fan of those characters in this franchise to sort of shrug it off and be like, yeah, okay, we got the motorcycle chase, that's cool. So exactly. I'm good with, there's enough in there for me to enjoy regardless. But it makes me wonder how much of that was how much of influence in Cloud Atlas was Lana versus Lily. The fact that Matrix Resurrections feels like such weirdly it feels like Matrix meets, it's like a Matrix story set in the world of Cloud Atlas in some ways, which is not necessarily a dig at it. We spent so long talking about how much we love Cloud Atlas, so I'm fine with that. But
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I wonder if that was part of the mindset behind bringing the same collaborators in.
I have a feeling it probably was. I mean, I think what you talked about, and thank you for correcting me on that, makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's one of those things where I'm sure I'm sure there are particular reasons for it, but at the same time I think so long as it works for the film itself, I think those type of choices to bring certain composers and collaborators back versus others can work. And I think in Resurrections it works more often than not than compared to what other people have to say. It basically goes to, look at it's an evolution of different ways of storytelling. I mean, look at what the Coen brothers are doing separate from one another. I mean, Tragedy of Macbeth is as far removed from anything the Coen brothers had really ever done before, but at the same time, you have Frances McDormand, you have Carter Burwell, you have some similar collaborators, but it's really an interesting shift from what we're used to in a Coen Brothers film while also maintaining a little bit of that Coen Brothers sensibility. I mean, you do kind of feel like that in some moments of Tragedy Macbeth. And look at Ethan. I mean, he's gonna be working with different collaborators for the first time in ages, and it's really interesting to see how filmmakers evolve over time. Sometimes people find new collaborators that it just makes sense to continue with them. I mean, Steven Spielberg hasn't had a different cinematographer from Janusz Kaminski since Schindler's List. I mean, there's a reason for that, but it's something that he wanted to stretch his wings with other collaborators, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens when John Williams retires too. It's like, who's he going to get to score his films? Is he going to go with some of the other is he going to work with one particular composer, or is he going to just see who seems to be a good fit for whatever particular story he's telling?
No, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, speaking of film music and collaborators, like the Spielberg Williams partnership has been going strong for decades. I'm sure that he didn't do every single Spielberg movie, right? Was there any that he?
So
there was a couple, I think, because it's like Elfman and Burton, where there was once or twice. I think like Howard Shore did Ed Wood, I believe, and
he did
things like that.
Yeah. So I know that especially with Howard Shore doing Ed Wood, that was a matter of Danny Elfman was just completely burned out after Nightmare Before Christmas, and he wanted to break from that collaboration. So Spielberg and Williams, technically their first time not working together was Twilight Zone the movie, where Spielberg directed a segment. Jerry Goldsmith did the score for all of that. And then you have The Color Purple, which Quincy Jones did, but that was a big part of that was because of the fact that was basically Quincy Jones drove that movie more than Spielberg did, really. So I think that was and I mean, it's a lovely score. If you've ever seen The Color Purple, it's a really great score. A few years ago, Bridge of Spies was Thomas Newman. I think that was a case where Williams' health was kind of getting in the way of things, and he also had Force Awakens at that point too. And then Alan Silvestri did Ready Player One, which I know part of it was health reasons, but I know Spielberg also felt it was important for to have Williams on The Post that winter. So and honestly, Silvestri makes a lot of sense because so he was as indicative. His music is as seminal to the 80s and the type of nostalgia that Ready Player One is playing off of than Williams is. So,
right. Yeah. Well, we have Williams coming back for the Indiana Jones, right? And then I think
the Fabelmans.
Is that his last? Yeah.
Yeah, he's got the Fabelmans for Spielberg, which is probably going to be his last one. And then, I would be surprised. Indy 5 is supposed to be his last one, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes a lot of sense because I don't know what... And I do actually kind of hope that that's the last Indiana Jones film we get. Because of the fact that, A, it's impossible to see anybody other than Harrison Ford in that role. And B, it's impossible to hear anybody other than John Williams scoring those films.
Right.
But I mean, that's going to be something that we're actually going to be talking about both of those collaborators in separate cases in the future in the Sonic Cinema podcast. But we're talking about composer collaborations with directors. It's a natural segue, I think.
Right.
But yeah, no, it was a great little segue because of the fact that it does play into what we're talking about with Cloud Atlas and Matrix resurrections in terms of, what is it that brings change in the way filmmakers collaborate with other people. I think that's kind of an interesting, it's always kind of an interesting subject because, not necessarily is every collaboration with a filmmaker going to last forever. So,
yeah, definitely.
So do you have anything more that you would like to talk about on the Cloud Atlas score before we wrap things up?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of how it plays in so distinctively to this film. I think we covered on both of these shows the rich themes of this movie and why people need to check it out. As we said on my show, it did massive underperformance at the box office, which is a huge disappointment to people like us who completely hold this up as. I haven't done my list. I know you have yours. You have this at number 1 for your best of 2012 on Letterboxd. I haven't done my top 10 of 2012, but I would imagine this has to be, if not in the top spot, very, very close.
Yes.
And the music is a huge part of it. So it's unclear what the future of the Wachowski's filmography is going to look like, but if nothing else, I feel like this was an outstanding piece of work, and the music is a part and parcel of it. It's inextricable from this movie, and I think it's as it should be. So I would encourage people to check out both the film and the score for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of those scores where you can listen to it because, like you said, there are some scores that are very difficult to listen to apart from the film. They're so specific to the film, and they don't necessarily hold the same type of re-listen value separate from the film. This one does in a lot of ways that I think are very interesting, and I really hope that you are listening to both of these podcasts in tandem because, in fact, I feel like we've done a really good job of separate. I know we talked about it earlier today about making sure that these were two very different listening experiences while also being connected by the commonality of this film, but approaching them from different perspectives. And I think we did a really good job with that. And this is one of my favorite scores of all time. It's one that really connected with me, and it's one that I go back to very, very frequently, and I absolutely love it. One more time before we sign off, Robert, where can people find your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, first of all, thank you so much for having me back on your show. I agree. I think between these two episodes, I feel like on my show, we tackled the movie Cloud Atlas, and on your show, we tackled the music Cloud Atlas, which I think is so cool and so fun of a way to approach this project where the two elements are intertwined in such a different way than you normally see in the industry. And people want to hear that episode again, or they're listening to this first and want to check that out. You can find Close Watch on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, and other podcatchers, as well as crookedtable.com. Like I said, we are doing on my other show, Franchise Detours, the Dark Knight trilogy. Speaking of great movie scores, Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard's score for Batman Begins. We talk about that on that episode, Dark Knight as well. And that's, again, an interesting dynamic where those score composers were divided the work between the action stuff, the Batman stuff, and the Bruce Wayne stuff, essentially. And each tackled an element of the Batman Begins story, at least. So definitely find those on your podcatcher of choice. And you can follow me on Twitter at Crooked Table.
Yes, and it's always fun to talk to Robert. I've enjoyed very much my times being on Close Watch and Franchise Detours, and look forward to more times in the future. I know we've got at least 2 on Franchise Detours that are that we've already talked about, and I can't wait to get to those discussions that are going to be really fascinating. And yes, you're welcome back to Sonic Cinema anytime. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Likewise.
I'd like to thank Robert for not only joining me on the Sonic Cinema podcast to talk about the score for Cloud Atlas, but having me on Close Watch to talk about the movie. I really, again, like I said in the episode, I do hope you get a chance to maybe even listen to these back and back. I think you'll get a really interesting collaboration on this movie, which is so much about connectivity, so much, and is such a rich text that I think is well worth discovering, especially if you haven't seen Cloud Atlas. It's a tremendous film. I love this. Thank you very much for joining me on the Sonic Cinema podcast. Once again, my original score for Platter PhD is available for pre-order on Bandcamp, and if you pre-order before the release on the 22nd, you will get access to 2 of the pieces on the soundtrack. Check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Out the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Google, Spotify. We've had so many great discussions this year. I can't wait to wrap up with what we have to wrap up with. It's going to be a lot of fun. Some more established classics, talking about one of the great filmmakers of all time, somebody who's formative in my life, that we actually talked about in this podcast, and then just talking about some of my favorite movies. And finally, as always, check out my written reviews at www.sonic-cinema.com.